This area of debate in relation to children online is not so much around children, but around online. And the question of what we really mean by the digital world or the digital environment, there's a lot of confusion, I think, about exactly what we're talking about in relation to technology. So, of course, we come to this when we do our work, knowing that there's been a long-standing critique of talk of technological determinism, a long-standing and still really important recognition of the way in which technological innovation spawns moral panics and anxieties about technological impacts on people. And yet I think we struggle to find another kind of a language. Can we find a language of soft determinism to recognize the power of technology and the kind of affordances of technology? Can we find a way of thinking about what in the social studies of technology they call the kind of assemblage of social and technological processes together? So I think, and then data and datafication adds a kind of new twist to how do we grasp the nature of the online or the technological or the digital?
Well, there's several that come to mind for me here. One is the question of whether technology-mediated crimes are a special category. And obviously they have some differences, but are they important enough that they need to be treated as a special different category? And do we need special theories or special explanations to account for them? Or are the kinds of explanations that we have and the kinds of variables that we've tended to look at generally to account for victimization and offending, can they just be applied without a whole lot of change in the technology environment? And my view is that as technology comes to infuse all communication and all social interaction, its usefulness as a category for differentiating things becomes weaker and weaker. So I think a lot of effort that is going into differentiating technology-related crime contexts is going to turn out to be wasted, and that we need to kind of consider the fact that we're just in a transition time right now. Similarly, there's a whole lot of, I think, misguided theorizing about the question of whether technology increases vulnerability or exacerbates the impact of victimization. I mean, there's a whole alarmist narrative about how the technology has made children so much more vulnerable to victimization, how it's exacerbated the effects of it because you can't get away from it. And I think these are tremendously oversimplified kinds of ideas. Technology is extremely complicated in the way that it transforms things. And so there are both ways in which it may increase vulnerability. It may be ways in which it's protective. There may be ways in which it increases the impact, or ways in which it minimizes the impact. And all that needs to be thoroughly researched and considered. But that seems to be a debate right now. There seem to be a lot of people who are very invested in highlighting and alarming people about the exacerbating effects of technology. And I think that is something that's going to be shown to be tremendously overblown once the research is all done.
My impression, there are at least three relevant trends that are reflected by current theoretical arguments. The first one is the need to grasp the context of children's life and children's growing up on a more theoretical level, on a deeper theoretical level, to understand how actually the interaction between and the co-construction of social context by the children that are involved, that we are interested. So they are part of these contexts, they contribute to these contexts. So all approaches, to my impression, are interesting that try to grasp this challenge with regard to the relevance of context. The second one has to do with the position of the child. What we can observe is an increasing trend to emphasize the agency of children within the whole field. This might be linked to the call for participatory approaches of research. This goes along with the increasing role of the children's rights issues as a kind of benchmark or as a kind of orientational concept for what do we think should be provided by society for children. And the third one is related to the media. I think highly interesting theoretical arguments in these days are being developed with regard to the new features, the new technical characteristics, automatization, for example, or the datafication of social life.
I think that there's an acknowledgement today that didn't exist when I was starting to do my work as a graduate student. Developmental perspective wasn't really popular. I came into the field when the United States was studying TV violence, and there were very few studies in the original Surgeon General study of 1982 that had anything of a developmental perspective. Social learning theory really was adevelopmental, which was the main theory of the time, that the same model for effects of social learning occurred at all ages for all people, and there are some differences around that. So I think one thing that has definitely come into the field since I started is the acknowledgement that children of different ages respond to and use technology differently, and that the developmental perspective is an important perspective to take across disciplines. I think the second thing that's happening today is that so much of what we've looked at has historically been learning cognitive outcomes. And I think there's an increasing acknowledgement, certainly in the developmental psych literature, but I also think increasingly in communication studies, that social emotional learning, that outside of cognitive issues, is also terribly important. In particular, as children age, the interaction between social emotional development and cognitive development is becoming much more obvious and of much more interest than it had been before. And I think that's a difference. I've come to an appreciation that the pediatric community has a very different perspective. The medical community has a different perspective from the social science community. And while in the past I have explored variations in the social science community, I think it's also important to understand the medical community, because technology is not just about children's learning and behavior. It does have implications for their well-being, and the medical community can have a better sense of how we look at well-being. So I find it interesting that over time I keep expanding where I want to go to try to understand a phenomenon. And it's been quite useful for me to open up my mind to looking at medical issues as well as much more the social cognitive learning issues.
Yeah, I think it's hard because it of course depends on who you ask. But since you ask me, what I find very interesting is that when I came back to the academic world and coming from a place of looking at censorship issues, I find that this discourse on children's rights in terms of access rights and rights to information and right to media access was almost non-existent. I mean, it was there, but it was always sort of underplayed by the argument of, well, if it's to protect children, then it's okay. Never really qualifying if that protection is legitimate or not, or if it's wise or if it's needed. Because who can be against protecting children? So I think that for the past years, we've seen an increase, which is helpful for me because this is what I'm interested in, is an increase in interest in looking at children's rights in a more complex way, that not just the right to protection, but the right to participation. And if we can try to discuss this also in relation to perceived and real media harm, I think that will really can give us some interesting, also theoretical and empirical debates moving forward.
Often what we are seeing is a sort of a clash between normative adult framings of the world and then children's own framings of the world. And in a way, you could read those as two different theorizations of the world, right? I think this comes to the fore when children talk about safety online. I think, you know, for adults, the concerns are, you know, the ones that come out of a lot of research, you know, very good research for that matter. You know, adults have concerns around things like their children being exposed to inappropriate content, or meeting and talking with strangers and potentially meeting them offline. You know, sort of, I guess, I mean, these are real concerns, and they're things that have motivated a lot of online safety education and really important. But when you talk to kids, you know, yeah, the majority of children have quite different concerns on some levels. They talk more about very everyday risks, like social risks, basically. You know, they talk about teen drama, or they talk about, you know, something their friend said that upset them, or an image they received that they didn't want to see, or, you know, but it's much more about their relationships to their, you know, the people they know in offline settings. And yeah, and you know, and I mean, the other, so you get this kind of clash, if you like, between the perceptions of what risks might be and where the harms might stem from. And I think this, you know, this raises a whole series of interesting questions about how we then direct online safety education, how we connect education that addresses those much more serious concerns that adults often have with children's very, you know, deeply personal lived experience. Yeah, and I think, you know, the other, or another good example is the difference that children make. Well, you know, adults often distinguish between the online and the offline. And so we talk about, you know, online safety and safety in the street as two different things. But for kids, of course, that distinction doesn't always hold. And so that, you know, they tend to think about digital media as just one more space in which they carry out their everyday lives and socialize with others and so on. It's just another space of socio-technical interaction for them. And yeah, and what that means is that they think they often don't have a window on some of the things that adults think they should have a window on. And so I think some of these clashes really, you know, I think they throw into stark contrast. Or they open up new possibilities, like things that we have to think differently about, we have to account for, and we have to respond to.
The field of children's studies in relation to media is so dominated by the behavioral sciences, and in that context by individualist psychology and a certain branch of sociology, but not all of it. There is such a monopoly on the way in which we are taught to think about children in that context that anybody who's not in that field is not in the field. And so I'm not in the field because I don't come from that tradition. And I work to some extent in opposition to it. There is a lot of criticism of individualist psychology. It's been around for a long time. I'm not the first to have discovered it. But the issue that kind of occupies you and me here is, well, what effect does that have on our knowledge of children? And the effect is that it helps people who are doing a certain kind of science to develop another fiction, a complete construction of the mind that does not exist in nature as such, or as observed, or as described. And that is the mind. And so they universalize the mind. They look at children as an example of that universal entity, and then discuss aspects of their behavior as a result. And that's really to do with the scientific method, the tradition of scientific method that is very cautious about meaning and identity and relationships and stories, but very very confident about evidence and observation and things. Well, I don't buy any of that. I don't buy any of it. I think, you know, evidence, observation, and things are as much a part of the story we tell ourselves as our stories. And so I don't feel that I'm in the field. I think that there's a time now with digital media, globalized media, and the kind of conversations that you and I can have across such distances. I think there's a time to say, well, technology, culture, and I don't know, meaning, need to be understood through more than one lens. You need to be able to say, yes, we need a science of the observation of these media, but you also need to understand what they're doing in terms of telling stories and so on.